Good morning, everyone. Hello. I hope everyone is enjoying these beautiful fall days that we've been having. Just gorgeous outside. All right, today is our fourth lecture in Egyptian art. And again, I would like to thank Neale for these wonderful lectures that he's giving, his time, and all the years of accumulated knowledge that he has collected over this time. We are so fortunate to be able to have this. I'm going to give just a little brief introduction again of him. Neale is a retired art professor emeritus, trader from North Park University. He has taught, and he also taught at Wittenberg for about 8 years. Neale is also an active sculptor in all mediums: bronze, wood, metal, stone, acrylic, welding, and other. 30 one-man art shows and more than 20 large public sculpture commissions. He is a mid-century modernist, which is how he would describe his art. He and his lovely wife, Marilyn, thank you, moved here to Otterbein in October of 2017, and they live over on Goldfinch. So please welcome Neale. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. It's probably not a good idea to start off a lecture with an apology, but I have to do that. It's a major, major sin in academia if you puff your resume. Major sin. You don't claim degrees you don't have. You don't claim things you haven't achieved. The other day when we came here, Jana said she wanted to give a longer introduction. So I just started throwing things at her, and I told her, well, I think I've had about 30 one-man shows. By the way, never count that kind of stuff. I never write it down or anything like that. Okay. When I went home, having a beer in the afternoon, I started thinking about what we said. And I said, 30 one-man shows. I started to think about it. I can only count 15, folks. So in the future, revise my introduction, Jana. It's only 15. How many shows? That number, I don't know. There are quite a few, but one-man shows are a different thing altogether. Okay, we're starting Egyptian art today. And in some ways, Egyptian art is a trickier subject to talk about, simply because many of you have seen TV specials. Some of you have even gone to the King Tut show. Egypt has fascinated Western culture more than any other early culture that we're going to talk about here. By the way, it just occurred to me as I mentioned that we won't meet here next week because of the Veterans Day activities going on campus. We'll meet the following week after that. I think it's the 18th, is it, Jana?
Yes.
Yeah, the 18th. So, okay, let's get back to talking about Egypt and Egyptian art. It's fascinated Western culture. Now, that's partly because, and you'll notice this in the outline I've given you, it's a coherent, understandable culture. The outline I gave you last week have 4 or 5 different cultures listed on it. And in the Middle East, they come and go, they come and go. The distinctive thing about Egyptian culture is it's the longest continuous culture the human race has seen up to this point. Now that's partly because of the geography. Art is always affected by place and site. And geography directly affects the visual arts as it affects all other parts of culture. As I mentioned last week, the Middle East is a wide open area. Various city-states, various empires emerge, and then they conflict with each other. Egypt geography is very different. Egypt is essentially a desert with a river running through it, the Nile River. The Nile River inundates every year, and so along the Nile, Egypt is surrounded by deserts on either side, and it's this green ribbon running through the desert, giving the nature of desert climate and the fertility of the soil because of the inundation of the Nile. Egypt also is a very, very fertile country, at least it was in the ancient world. The Romans called Egypt their breadbasket. The other thing about Egypt is that it starts to interface with cultures we know about. You're familiar with the Moses stories, the Joseph stories from the Bible. They interface with the world of Egypt. And of course, the Greeks and the Romans, the finishing point of the Egyptian culture we're going to talk about is at the time when the Greeks and Romans start to move around the Mediterranean and they conquer Egypt. And so in that process, they bring their own culture to Egypt. And so even well into the classical world that we'll be looking at in the spring, if you follow me in these lectures, even into that time frame, you have ancient cities that are in Egypt. Many of you have probably heard of Alexandria. Alexandria was a very, very important ancient city. Giant library was in Alexandria. And so the Greeks and Romans interfaced with the Egyptians. And even up to what I would call modern times, during the time of Napoleon, the French came into Egypt as part of Napoleonic conquests, and they did something that sort of radically reaffirmed our interest in Egypt. They ran across something that was called the Rosetta Stone. I don't know if any of you have heard about that or not, but it was an ancient stele or marker, and it had 3 sides and languages on each side. And up to that point, Egyptian hieroglyphics had been a mystery to the world. Now, Egyptian hieroglyphics are very, very complex language because last time I talked about pictographic language that deal with visual images, and typically pictographic languages have giant, giant alphabets, 15, 20,000 characters. Then I talked about phonetic alphabets that typically don't go more than 40 or 50 characters because they care about sound. They try to replicate sound. The weird thing about the Egyptian language is it does both. And it's very tricky to understand it. The Rosetta Stone helped us do that. One last thing to say about Egypt, because it was not conquered in quite the way the other Middle Eastern societies were, most of its history in architectural reform remains with us today. there are almost no remnants left of most of those Middle Eastern cultures we talked about last time. But the pyramids are with us, the temples at Luxor are with us, the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut is with us. These are still with us today. So that's giving us a sort of special connection to Egyptian culture. Most people in the West think of Egypt as the starting point for our history. They don't think of Mesopotamia as a starting point. They think of Egypt as the starting point because it's much more familiar to us than those cultures of Mesopotamia. Okay, with that much of starting point, let's start looking at some objects here. As I say, Egypt is a kind of neat, linear culture, and you rarely ever find an object like this at the beginning of a culture. If there's anything I want you to remember about my lecture on Egypt, it's this object, the palette of a Narmer. First of all, you wonder, what's a palette? It's a stone slab on which the Egyptians mixed eye makeup. So you know the surface here is almost engraved. It's what you call a very low relief sculpture. Now the reason this thing is so important is not only does it tell us a lot about the beginnings of Egypt, but it presents for us the whole style that's going to pervade Egyptian culture throughout its extensive several thousand-year history. What I typically call this a flattened style. You look at the palette of Narmer. Let me give you a little background here. Narmer was the king or pharaoh who united Egypt. Egypt has an upper part at the Mediterranean, a lower part reaching down into Africa. They were separate very early on. Narmer conquered southern Egypt and united it as a continuous country and continuous culture. That's why he's so important. And he's represented on the palette on the left. The giant figure there holding the baton is Narmer. Now keep in mind, he represents what we call hierarchical proportion. He was no bigger than anyone else as far as we know, but he's culturally important, so he's represented as physically larger than other figures. He takes on godlike attributes, and if you look to his left, you'll see a serpent holding something that you probably can't recognize. He's holding sandals. You've heard the idea of holy ground. It shows up in the Bible with Moses and the burning bush. And so the ground Narmer stands on is holy ground. And like ancient kings, he connects himself to religion. So you can see him holding the baton, and then he has one of the figures that he's conquered from Lower Egypt, and he's holding him by the hair. You'll notice above that imagery, you have this funny thing that actually is a head shape and then papyrus plants coming out of it. That's a symbol for Lower Egypt. That's what he conquered. And you'll notice above that is a hawk. That's the god Horus, who is the sky god, who sort of symbolizes Upper Egypt. And so the hawk is above the papyrus. You'll notice male imagery with the bull heads at the top of the palette. And if you look carefully, you see this funny little cartouche shape there. That's Narmer's name. And you notice it appears on both sides of the palette. These are not two palettes. You're seeing both sides at once. That's the glyph for his name. Now, if you continue looking at the left side, you see, as I say, this flattened perspective, and that's there to make the narrative clear. They're not interested in representing visual reality. They're interested in telling stories. And so they flatten the figures out to make it clear that what's going on. If I hold my hand like this, it's foreshortened. It doesn't look like a hand. If I hold my hand like this, it's immediately recognizable as a hand. They flattened everything out to make it clear what was going on. And they continued that flattened style throughout their whole history. Now at the bottom panel below Narmer's feet there, again you have fallen figures, fallen enemies, and there's a little symbol in there, you can't see it very clearly, that represents a conquered town. Now if you move to the other side of the panel, again, you have the bulls at the top. You have Narmer as part of a procession. You'll notice a whole row of figures there. And Narmer, again, of course, is the biggest of the figures. And then you move along through that procession, and you'll notice these funny little, what appear to be figures there on the right side of the palette. Those are warriors he's conquered. They're all dead, lined up neatly. If Egyptian art is anything, it's neat. Egyptian art is always lined up around some sort of axis because the whole culture is lined up around the axis of the river. But you'll notice, if you look carefully, it's hard to see it in this image, they don't have heads, and their heads are laying between their legs. So these are all these conquered figures that Narmer has. Oh, okay, thank you, Bob.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, there are their heads there. Now, below that image are two figures that are kind of mysterious. Various historians interpret them in multiple ways. I think the simplest way to put them, to imagine them, is they're griffins. Griffins are figures that are put together of composite animals. So they have the bodies of lions and the necks and head of snakes. They become a fertility image, and because their necks cross over, they create a unified figure, a circle. And that becomes a metaphor for the unity of Egypt now. Below that, if you look carefully, you'll see a bull again. You'll see a funny arc shape there. That represents city walls, a citadel that Narmer has destroyed, and below that are prostrate figures again. So this palette gives us the whole format of the way Egypt art is going to be operating. For the remainder of this lecture, you're going to simply see this art form repeated over and over again, and some of these symbols repeated over and over again. Can we see the next one, Jenna? A lot of people identify Egypt with pyramids. And pyramids have a history that has some relationship to the Middle East. Remember, Egypt is not very far from the cultures we talked about, and there was some interplay between those cultures. Remember, when we looked at the structures from the Middle East, I showed you a ziggurat. Now, originally, the Egyptians buried their pharaohs in what we call mastabas. They were simply a slope-sided, flat structure, and beneath that, deep in the earth, was the burial for the pharaoh. Eventually, what they started to do is multiply those mastabas, one on top of the other. So this thing looks like a ziggurat. This is the pyramid of King Zoser. And you'll notice around it you have other structures. Typically, pyramids are not standalone structures. There are what we call funerary districts around them, temples and various special sites around the pyramid. And in this particular case, Zoser is not buried in the pyramid, he's still buried underneath it. But rather quickly, we'll move on. Can we see the next one, Jana? Now you can see step pyramids in the front image here. But here are the so-called Great Pyramids of Egypt. Eventually, that format evolved into these more geometric figures. The way we see them today is very different from the way they were originally made. They originally had a facing stone that has all either been pulled away or crumbled away. That was a white limestone. You get a hint of that at the peak of the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khufu. Now the pharaohs actually are buried inside of these pyramids. They're not beneath them. These become funeral sort of places to commemorate the reign of these pharaohs. Now the thing that you need to understand about them, though, is you have the Egyptian bright sun. You have these things smooth-sided with white limestone. And at the very peak, the section you see up here, the pyramid is covered with a thin sheet of gold, real gold. Now, what this is an attempt to connect these pharaohs to the dominant Egyptian god. The Egyptians have a whole pantheon of gods. So there are many of them. But the most dominant of them is Ra. Sometimes it's said Re, but R-A is the typical pronunciation of the Egyptian sun god. And imagine the Egyptian sun with this white surfaced object with gold at its top and how it would reflect the sun. The whole idea here is this connects the pharaoh to the god. Remember, the Egyptian pharaohs are thought to be godlike in their presence and in their being. Now, one of the things you want to be thinking about here, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is although these are incredible pieces of engineering ancient world. And look at the dating here. We're way back in time. They represent a religious perspective that is not universal in Egypt. The elites had a religion, and the people who made these pyramids could care less. It might very well have been the robbers that eventually got into these pyramids, or the guys who built them. They were the only ones who knew where these passages were going. Every one of these monuments that we're talking about in Egypt has been robbed. Every one of them, these above ground monuments. So how reverent were the average Egyptians? I think this is a religion associated with priesthood and the kingship. And remember when we looked at the victory stele of Naram-Sin, I talked to you about this association between these celestial bodies and the king. He was the highest in that stele. Here we associate the pharaohs with the sun god, the highest and most important of the gods. Can we see the next one, please? Here he is. This is Caffrey. He's the guy, by the way, he has double names. He is the guy for whom the Great Pyramid is made. Now this sculpture, and by the way, it's in diorite, extremely hard igneous rock. This sculpture represents the normal character of Egyptian sculpture. The flat relief that we looked at of Narmer helps us understand their two-dimensional imagery. This sculpture helps us understand the way they thought of sculpture. And by the way, you can't see it from this view, but behind his head is the god Horus, a hawk sort of clasped around the back of his head. If you see a side view of this sculpture, you'll see Horus back there. Again, the king associated sky god. By the way, how did Horus become the sky god? If you've ever seen hawks fly and hunt, they're soaring birds. They don't move their wings a lot. And sometimes they circle, especially if the atmospheric conditions are right. And they circle and they go higher and higher and higher, follow these air drafts, and sometime appear to disappear into the sky. That's probably how Horus became the sky god. Now you notice the statue is carved out of a cubic piece of stone. It becomes the seat that Caffrey is seated on, but that is the rough shape of the block from which he's carved. And you notice his pose is not relaxed at all. It's the same cubic shape as the block itself. And look at the head. He just looks straight ahead. He doesn't react. He just this stone, literally stone figure that doesn't represent anything other than royalty, grandeur. He just is. He doesn't need to do anything. He's immobile. His very presence makes him important. What he does doesn't matter. So you'll see this fixed quality that becomes pretty much a part of a lot of Egyptian sculpture we're going to see. Other symbols are carved on the side of the throne associated with other Egyptian deities. Now last time we talked a little bit about carving, and I'll mention it again. As I say, this is extremely hard stone, and they did not have steel. So how they carved this is a major mystery to us. We need, one thing we know for sure, it took forever. It took teams of sculptors working for years and years and years to make an image like this.
There's an awfully natural appearance to his face. There's a natural appearance to his face.
Yeah, it's meant to be somewhat lifelike, but idealized. Again, kings, we'll see this in the Roman world and the Greek world. When you represent the emperor, you give him this glorious body. You idealize him, and so the body and the face are somewhat idealized. Oops, the next one, please. However, when you move down the social scale, you get a slightly different way of representing things. Now, in the ancient world, given the fact that the language is so complex, to be a scribe is a very, very big deal. This is not a literate culture. The pharaohs can't read. No one can read but the scribes. And the scribes, therefore, become the sort of figures that hold the whole history in their brains. They're very gifted people associated with language, and eventually, because they're so important in the culture, they also take on a priest-like quality. And later on, we're going to talk about how the scribes and the priests take over Egypt, and then someone has to bring it back to its origins. This is a limestone representation. Notice limestone is a much softer stone than diorite, so it's a much more modest stone, much easier to carve. Typically, Egyptian sculptures get painted. And by the way, when we see sculptures from the ancient world, you've seen Greek statues and so on, you've seen the Parthenon. We always see that as white, but in fact, most of that was painted. That was a very common thing to do in the ancient world. This guy is a scribe, and notice he's represented in a much less idealized way and a much humbler pose. But the very fact that he's represented at all tells us this guy is really important in this culture. I don't know if any of you have been watching public television lately. Just the other night I saw a program about a scribe in the New Kingdom in Egypt, much later in its history. And his tomb was below ground, had 22 rooms in his tomb. 22 rooms. It's a huge, complicated underground warren of rooms. So scribes become the sort of repositories for culture, but because they are not kings, they are less deified, less glorified in their pose and in their anatomy. And we see the next one. One of the distinctive things about Egyptian culture, even though the pharaoh is a dominant figure in most of their imagery, they represent women in a much more dignified and important way than other ancient cultures did. And this is the temple of Queen Hatshepsut. She, in fact, did govern Egypt for a period of time in the New Kingdom. By the way, Egyptian history is normally broken into three pieces. What we call the Old Kingdom, the pyramids, Palace of King Narmer would be part of that cluster of years. Then there's a period called the Middle Kingdom, when a strange thing happened. Some mysterious people came into Egypt, conquered Egypt. They were called the Hyksos. We really don't know very much about them at all. But they conquered Egypt, and so the art of Egypt starts to represent a more troubled look. It doesn't have the confident look in the Middle Kingdom. But then after 300 or 400 years, the Egyptians throw the Hyksos out. And now we have the New Kingdom. And Queen Hatshepsut was part of the New Kingdom. This is her funerary temple, and you notice how beautifully it relates to the landscape. It looks almost like a Frank Lloyd Wright organic building. It's meant to relate to the landscape. It has this beautiful horizontality that, and its color and materials, of course, have a direct reflection in the landscape itself. As you can see, she was a very, very big deal. There's a mortuary temple in the back of this complex with a statue, or there would have been a statue of her in it. Can we see the next one? As I was just mentioning, women get represented in ways that are unique in the ancient world here. Even though it's a male-dominated culture, we notice how the bull animal shape dominated the palette of Narmer. Women start to get represented in ways that give them a certain importance. And you see often when you see these relationships depicted, this is a limestone relief. Again, it would have been painted. You can see a kind of affectionate relationship between these figures. You're going to see that again in another minute or two in another image we're going to be looking at. But again, notice the kind of flattened style here. They just never get away from that. Everything just gets flattened out so the narrative is clear. So the eyes in the face look like they're straight ahead, but in fact you're getting a side view of the face. That's like modern Cubists like Picasso represent multiple perspectives like that. The Egyptians did that long before Picasso did. Now, can we see the next one? As I mentioned when we looked at the image of the scribe, as you move down the social hierarchy, the style starts to soften and relax. And the Egyptians are great painters of nature. And they love nature. In fact, the walls in the tombs often represent the happiest pastimes of the pharaoh that's entombed there. This happens to be a wall painting of a pond in a garden. And again, it's this flattened style, so you get a side view of the trees around the garden, a side view of the animals in the pond, the geese and the fish, and then a straight up and down vertical view of the pond itself. But you notice how much more complex and lively the whole image is, with all the colors, the accurate depiction of the fish in the pond, papyrus plants in the pond itself. And the Egyptians had some kind of relationship that I don't fully understand with geese and ducks. some of the most elegant images that you see of Egyptian representation of animals are of geese and ducks. And where that comes from, I don't know. Obviously, water is a major motif in Egyptian life because you've got deserts on both sides and you're clinging to life along this river. Okay, can we see the next one? Let's reorganize things a little bit. We'll come back to this in a second. Can you give me the next one, Jana? And then one after that. Okay. Look carefully at this image and look at the measurements. It's 12 inches by 15 inches. Just a little bitty limestone panel. The reason I wanted to shift our order around a little bit, this is Ignatin and his family. Ignatin is a major revolutionary figure in ancient Egypt. The priestly class, the scribes, ended up almost totally dominating the civic life of Egypt. And Ignatin broke that whole hierarchy apart by proclaiming the sun, the Atun, A-T-U-N, that's another word they have for the sun disk itself. That's where his name, it's embedded in his name. He becomes the first monotheist in the ancient world, associated with very different monotheism than Jewish monotheism. Egyptian monotheism is associated with an object in creation, the sun. It had always been a dominant motif in the whole Egyptian pantheon. But Ignatin says, forget all those other deities. This is the one that counts. And what you're looking at here is a small panel representing Ignatin. He's the figure on the left. And his wife, Nefertiti, you're going to see an image of her in a little bit. And you'll look at the head of that female figure and you'll start to figure out what I'm talking about. And their daughters. And they're holding the daughters in their laps. And you see it's a much more relaxed set of poses, much more humane imagery. But you got that sun disk in the top, and then its rays spreading down to this royal family. And of course, some of the Egyptian script is a part of the image itself. But by making that single unified deity, Ignatin caused a huge, huge disturbance. He not only broke that priestly caste apart, but he moved the capital to a different place. So he really revolutionized things. By the way, he's typically represented in this thin, elongated, kind of curvilinear form that you see here. So the whole style loses some of that cubic quality, gets a much softer look like we associated with the painting imagery we looked at a few moments ago.
You know, there was a term, as I recall, in history at this time, Amen-Ra, that came into being in about this time. Is that not right? Amen-Ra.
Amen-Ra, Ra, of course, would be the sun god. Yeah. That's probably a worship term associated with Ignatin's reign. Amarna, by the way, is a place, they may have moved from Thebes to Amarna. That's where the new capital was. Now, Can we back up a little bit, Jana? Let's go back to the images. One more back. Okay. This is what Ignatin was fighting against. This is one of the giant Egyptian temples. This is a temple of Ramses II. And the outer wall of these temples typically is called a pylon. So it has this tapered look about it. And then it's usually preceded by a bunch of statues of a pharaoh. Some of those statues have been moved to Western museums. And by the way, it's hard to get a sense of scale here. These things are absolutely colossal in size. You're going to get a little better sense of that in another image I'm going to show you. But one of the things I want to help you understand about the Egyptian temples, although they became part of districts that spread out all over the place, the main temples are like Egyptian society. They run in a neat line. Again, that river dominates everything. The whole culture runs in this sort of linear direction. So what you do, and this becomes a model for ancient temples, you have behind this pylon wall, that's your entrance to the temple. You get an entrance in the middle of that wall, and then behind it, you get an open courtyard, fairly open. And by the way, some of this stuff becomes a model for the Hebrew temple. So you got this open courtyard, and the temple is just like society itself. It's hierarchical. If you're a nobody, you can go in the courtyard. Then behind the courtyard, typically, is what we call a hopa-style hall. It's a forest of columns. And can we see the next image, please? No, I'm sorry, backwards, or other way, yeah. Yeah, that's part of a hopa-style hall there. Now you see people there, and you start to get a sense of the scale of this whole operation. So you have the hall, then it leads to another smaller courtyard. Then there's another hall. You're following an axis, remember? And each time you move along that axis, your status changes. So only certain people can go so far into the temple. At the very back of the temple is a small room. Typically, it's not very big. The Greek word is naos, or sometimes it's called the cella. It's the exact same thing that was part of the Jewish temple. It's the Egyptian Holy of Holies. And only the Pharaoh can go in there. And there's usually a cult statue of the deity in there. That was what was so amazing to the Romans when they conquered Jerusalem. And Titus marches in the temple, and of course the whole idea is they desecrate the temple. Titus marches in the temple, walks into the Holy of Holies, and there's nothing there. He can't figure out what the heck are these people worshiping. That's a totally different concept than Ignatin's approach towards the idea of a single God. You get a sense of scale here. And by the way, you'll notice these dates here. These temples are after the reign of Ignatin. What happened is Ignatin was a revolutionary figure but eventually the priestly class took over, and this is the temple of Ramses II. It's dedicated to Ammon, and it follows after the reign of Ignatin. And most of these temples are located at a place called Luxor in Egypt, and they're giant, giant complexes. But you notice how intact they are compared to most of the stuff we talked about in terms of the Mideast. These are the reasons that Western culture is so fascinated with Egypt, because there's so much of it that still exists. Okay, can we go back then? Okay, now we've seen Ignatin and his wife. This is the head I was talking about. This is Queen Nefertiti. And by the way, I noticed the other day, if you're looking at your outline, there's a typo date on, I think it's the, let's see, wait a minute here. Ignatin and his family. That should be the same date as Queen Nefertiti. We have it down there, 3,300. That's not the way it should be, but it should be 13. This is Nefertiti. Again, it's done in limestone, a more informal material. The statue, as you can see, it's painted. The statue was actually found in a sculptor's workshop, and so it's regarded as unfinished. I'm not sure, I haven't seen it in actuality, so I'm not ready to say exactly where it's unfinished, but it's regarded as unfinished. You'll notice one of the ears are broken off, and for some reason or other, the Egyptians always represented the ears as sticking way out from the head rather than close to the head, and I'm not quite sure exactly where that comes from. Anyway, she's regarded as one of the most elegant sculptures that the world has ever produced. And again, it's a female figure, so I think you can start to understand what I'm saying about the Egyptians. It's a complicated culture. It's not male-dominated, totally, only that kind of thing. There are other sort of understandings associated with women here that are much more sophisticated than you see anywhere else in the ancient world. Now can we have the next one? Some of you might have seen this object in person. In fact, there was an exhibit of some of the works from the tomb of Tutankhamun in Chicago about 15, 20 years ago. This is the cover for the coffin. Tutankhamun died as a relatively young man. During his reign, he was a young man. The priests got back in power and brought back the old complex multi-god religion. And the reason we know a bit about Tutankhamun, he was not a particularly important pharaoh. Of course, he's late in the New Kingdom. The reason we know about him is the Egyptians got so tired of the tombs being robbed, they started to hide them. Dig them way down in the earth in an area called Valley of the Kings. And this tomb wasn't discovered until I think it was about the 1920s, somewhere in there it was discovered. And there might even be still tombs in there that we don't know about. The interesting thing about this tomb, it was unbothered, but in fact there are signs that robbers had been in it. Things were knocked over, a couple things were taken, but somehow they had been interrupted in their thievery, and then it was forgotten again. And so you have all these amazing objects. This cover for the sarcophagus is gold and lapis and turquoise. And again, it goes back to this ancient kind of dignified king look. You know, it just totally sort of looks straight ahead, doesn't respond to us at all. The cover has about 250 pounds of gold in it. Yeah, 250 pounds of gold, imagine that.
You know, what about the curse of the tomb?
Yeah, you know, so several of the people that discovered this had mysterious deaths later on in England, but some people say that there's some curse written, inscribed in hieroglyphs in the tomb itself. I don't know. Who knows? But several of the figures did, in fact, die strange deaths. I think, is that the last one we've got, Jan? I'm trying to give us enough time for a couple questions here. Okay, here we go. Again, you can see the block-like form that the figures are carved from. This is a pharaoh and his wife. Again, it's carved in diorite. And again, the figures are idealized, but they have this kind of tender gesture. You notice she has her arm around his back. If you look carefully, you'll see her hand coming over his stomach area. You know, it's exquisitely carved. They had a fairly developed medical science, partly associated with the entombing process that they were involved with. And so the sculptors knew human anatomy pretty well and human proportionality, but again, they idealized it. Now I want to give a couple minutes at least for questions. Anything I can help you with here? Anyone? Yes?
Why was Nefertiti's neck so long?
That's the style of that particular era. You probably noticed that little panel I showed you with Ignatin and her. Both of them are represented with these long, thin limbs. I think it's partly a cultural style, but what it basically does is humanize the figure. And that's a distinctive part of that particular era. The kings aren't kings anymore in the sense we think of kings. The god is God and the king is king. Ignatin is an extraordinary figure, and I suspect that's part of it. But of course, what he does is he uses that queenly hat. I don't know what the name for that hat is, but it's such an elegant shape, and it reinforces the thinness and length of that neck. Maybe she was a very thin, maybe both of them are relatively thin people. It's hard to say. When you're dealing with hierarchies like this, the representation you see starts to just bewilder us. What were they really like? When we get to Rome, I'm going to start to be able to show you what the kings actually looked like. And some of them were not pretty. One of them looked show you a nude figure of a Roman king, and you swear it's a picture of Lyndon Johnson without his clothes on. Okay, is there any? Yes?
I like this, but why does he have the fists? He looks like he's very angry.
He's holding something. They hold these objects. I think this is something associated with
Oh, okay.
the kingly, it looks like some batons or something that he's probably holding. Anything else? Anyone? Yeah, Earl.
I recall seeing some depiction of a female, possibly ruler, with a beard.
With a mirror?
Beard.
Oh, with a beard. Oh, yes.
I think that was
Yeah,
supposed to be a sign of.
yeah, the kingship. That was probably Hatshepsut, because she was a ruler, so that beard thing becomes part of the signature of who she is. Remember, Egyptians, the thing that's important to Egyptians is clarity, order. That's how you maintain a civilization for like 3,000 years. You keep it unified, you keep everyone thinking in terms of clarity and order, and that's the way you hold a society together. Romans tried to learn that from the Egyptians, and they did a pretty good job. They lasted quite a while, but eventually fell apart for them. We'll be talking about them in the spring, if any of you guys last that long. Any other questions I can help you with? Janet?
The Egyptians were around about 3,000 years before the pyramids were at about 3,000 BC. Any idea how long this civilization was going on prior to that? Because in order to build those, they
Yeah,
had to get
that's
to a
right.
certain level of,
That's right. That's
stability.
Yeah. At least 1,000 years prior to the pyramids. I've seen a lot of dates in the 4s. I haven't seen any dates
Earlier
in the
than
5s BC associated. Yeah.
In medical history, they talk about some of the things that the Egyptians did surgically
Yeah.
that preceded. For instance, circumcision was probably not begun by the Jews.
Yeah.
It was begun by the Egyptians
Right.
because of their armies out in the field. These guys who were not circumcised ended up with what we call balanitis, and they had to be circumcised because they couldn't tolerate the discomfort.
Yeah, there are all kinds of interfaces between Egyptian culture and biblical culture. Yeah, I had another question.
I have a question, well, not a question, but a comment dealing with the Egyptians having animals looking like people. There are a lot of, when I went to the British Museum, I saw half women, half alligators, half women, half lion,
That's right.
some cats even.
That's
Very, very interesting that they were able to make animals and people.
Well, that's partly their deities get represented that way. Various animals get connected to various deities. So it's a part human body and then the head of some sort of an animal or something. Yeah. It's a very complicated pantheon. Osiris is a major, he's the god of death in Egypt, but there are all kinds of secondary deities. Again, the only ones who really understood this were the priests. The average Egyptian probably could care less about most of this. So we're dealing with a stratified world in that ancient world. The Greeks are going to start to break that apart. We'll see that in the spring. The word democracy comes from Greek culture. The demos were the people. Democracy is government by the people. That's a whole different way of thinking about things. We'll talk about that in the spring. By the way, we have one more early culture to talk about, the Aegean culture, which is totally different from the Egyptian culture. It's a much more light-hearted, it's informal culture, and we'll get a chance to talk about it on the 18th of November if you stay with us. It's about time for us to finish now. Any final question I can help anyone with? Thank you again for coming, folks.